A Quiet Weather Station. Episode 4. Cloud Forms in the Lamplight. Low clouds moved above the valley in broad, peaceful layers, softening the laid light without dimming it altogether. From the station window, Elias watched their level undersides pass over the farm roofs and the pale bends of the road. At 48, he had learned to let a first impression settle before he tried to classify it. He stood comfortably in his slate waistcoat, cream shirt, and brown boots, one hand resting beside the gray enamel mug on the desk. The tea inside had cooled enough to leave only a faint warmth in the metal. He shifted the mug away from the blue ledger, opened the ledger to a clean leaf, and wrote the date and hour in the upper corner. Then he looked out once more. The layer held together over the eastern fields, but showed narrow seams above the western hills. That difference gave him the evening's useful task. Compare the present forms with the station's glass archive. He laid a linen cloth on the clear half of the desk, smoothing each fold with his palm until no ridge remained beneath it. By the time he turned toward the shallow cabinet, the room, the page, and his attention were all prepared. The cabinet occupied a broad recess beneath the lowest shelf, built wide rather than deep so that no glass plate had to stand behind another. Its cedar front held 6 small panels and a single brass escutcheon, dulled where many careful hands had steadied a key. Elias brought the brass lamp nearer, trimmed its flame to a quiet oval, and watched light travel across the cabinet's grain. He took the small brass key from the cedar case on the desk, checked that the linen cloth lay clear of the lamp, and fitted the key into the lock. A short turn released the tongue with a soft, definite click. He did not pull at once. Instead, he pressed 2 fingers lightly against the upper rail while his other hand drew the door forward, keeping the old hinges from taking the weight abruptly. The cedar scent inside was dry and faint, mingling with warm brass and paper. 6 shallow trays appeared, 3 on each side, their narrow label frames aligned. Elias opened the door fully until its stop met the inner block. Nothing leaned or shifted. He set the key beside the ledger, where its small bright shape would remain visible. Before touching a tray, he wiped each cedar pool with a clean corner of linen and inspected the cloth after reliant. Only a faint, dry trace came away. The action removed what his fingers might otherwise carry to a glass edge, and left all 6 handles in the same prepared condition. He folded that used corner inward, placed the linen beside the ledger, and began the inventory with the cabinet safely open. He read the tray labels from upper left to lower right before touching any handle. The first marked high fibers and veils, the second, middle sheets and rounded fields, the third, lower layers and rolls. On the right were mixed forms, local comparison sequences, and plates awaiting seasonal review. Each label matched the index written on the inside cover of the blue ledger. Elias ran a finger down that index without pressing the paper, speaking the tray numbers under his breath only once as he paired word with place. The exercise was simple, but it prevented habit from replacing observation. A cabinet could look orderly while holding one plate in a plausible but incorrect slot. He placed a narrow paper marker beside each ledger line as he confirmed it, leaving 6 pale tabs along the page. The visual rhythm pleased him. Label, ledger, marker, label, ledger, marker. When the final tab rested beside the seasonal view entry, he stepped back far enough to see the whole cabinet. All 6 handles sat flush. No divider cord showed above its rail, and no plate edge caught the lamplight at an angle. The outer inventory was complete, so he moved to the glass itself. Elias drew the upper left tray forward with both hands, one supporting its underside while the other held the cedar pole. The runners moved easily for the first span and then slowed against the felted stop. He stopped there, neither lifting nor twisting, and allowed the contents to settle. 12 glass plates stood upright in padded dividers, each separated by a strip of faded blue wool. Their upper corners bore small, inked numbers that progressed from 1 to 12. Compared them with the ledger column, touching only the divider tabs. 1, 2, 3, onward, to 12. Plate 7 sat a fraction lower than its neighbors, yet its number remained visible and its glass remained vertical. He noted the lower seat in pencil beside the inventory line, not as a fault but as a fact, to check when the plate was removed. The remaining plates shared the same height and even spacing. Fine dust lay along the tray's exposed front ledge, while the glass faces showed only a muted haze under the angled lamp. Elias replaced both hands on the tray and eased it inward until the pull met the cabinet face. The first group was present, sequential, and stable. The upper right tray contained the middle forms, 16 places divided into 2 numbered sequences. Elias opened it to the stop and shifted the lamp slightly left so its direct reflection would not conceal the corner marks. Rounded fields filled the first sequence, small, even teeps, broader joined masses and shallow rolls represented in patient black line. The second sequence held sheets whose margins varied from smooth to gently broken. He counted the first 8 by their numbers, moved his gaze across the central spacer, and counted the next 8 without touching the glass. At number 11 he paused. The plate was in its proper numerical place, but its tab carried a tiny pencil dot indicating that an earlier observer had used it for low-layer comparison. Elias located the same dot in the ledger index and found the corresponding cross-reference. Nothing was misplaced. The mark was deliberate. He copied the cross-reference onto a temporary slip and laid it beside the linen cloth, ensuring that the distinction would survive the later grouping work. After checking the padded sides and the firm central spacer, he returned the tray. The 16 plates were accounted for, and the unusual dot had been understood rather than merely noticed. The lower left tray came next, its cedar pole slightly broader from years of use. It held 14 plates of low sheets, banks, and rolls, all close enough in apparent shape that their marginal scale marks mattered. Elias opened the tray, waited for the felt stop, and read each scale before he read each title. Numbers 29 through 42 followed in order. Several plates had heavier black lines along their lower edges, and 2 showed open spaces between rounded sections. The lamplight made those openings appear almost blue because the padded dividers stood behind them. Elias resisted the easy conclusion that they matched the evening sky. Comparison would come later, after cleaning. For now he checked the material facts. Each corner was intact. Each marginal strip faced the same direction. The wall separators rose evenly around the glass without folding over the drawings. One divider beside plate 36 felt loose when he pressed its cloth tab, so he marked that number in pencil and chose a fresh padded slot near the center of the desk for temporary use during cleaning. He then closed the tray with a measured push. Its collection was complete, and the single soft divider had a clear handling plan. He continued through the mixed form and local comparison trays, alternating his stance so that his shoulders remained loose. The mixed set held 10 plates arranged by paired contrasts rather than by height, smooth beside piled, continuous beside broken, thin beside dense. Elias verified each pair against a bracket in the ledger index. The local sequence held 9 plates drawn from observations made at the station's veranda, their marges bearing tiny direction arrows, and months rather than formal titles. Here he found the familiar western ridge rendered as a low ink line beneath the cloud studies. He placed a second temporary slip on the cloth, recording that these 9 would offer the closest reference to the present valley view. The last tray, Seasonal Review, held 5 plates only. Their broad spacing made the empty padded slots look intentional, and the ledger confirmed 11 vacancies reserved for future transfers. Elias counted both contents and openings, because empty places were part of the cabinet's order. He closed the tray, aligned its pull with the others, and looked over the 6 paper markers beside the index. Every external label and every internal count now agreed. The inventory had moved from assumption to verified sequence. With the counts established, Elias prepared a working route that would keep removed plates from crossing one another. He set the blue ledger beyond the upper edge of the linen cloth, the gray enamel mug beyond the ledger, and the cedar case to the right of the brass lamp. Along the cloth he placed 3 temporary padded dividers, each wide enough for a single plate. The first would receive a plate being examined, the second a plate ready for cleaning, and the third a clean plate awaiting comparison. He tested each divider with an empty card cut to the dimensions of the glass. The card entered without catching, and stood without leaning. He withdrew it, folded it into the cedar case, and turned the lamp wick down by the smallest degree. The softer angle revealed surface dust more clearly than a bright frontal glare. Finally he set the 2 temporary slips at the lower corner of the ledger and weighed them with the small brass key. The arrangement formed a calm circuit from cabinet to cloth and back. No object needed to pass over another, and every plate would have one known resting place between actions. Before beginning, he made a concise condition note for each tray. The high forms showed light dust and even padding. The middle forms showed light haze, 1 documented cross-reference, and sound dividers. The low forms showed heavier ledge dust and 1 soft divider beside plate 36. The mixed pairs and local sequence appeared stable, while the seasonal tray had 5 occupied and 11 reserved spaces. Elias kept each entry to a single line, then placed a small tick beside it after looking back at the corresponding tray. The repeated glance joined the written inventory to the physical cabinet. When all 6 ticks were present, he blotted the pencil dust from the page with the clean edge of the linen cloth and closed the ledger halfway, leaving the inventory leaf visible beneath the cover. Outside, the cloud layer had progressed far enough westward for a pale band to widen above the hills. Inside, the cabinet no longer presented an undifferentiated rank of glass. It had become 6 known groups, with counts, conditions, and a safe order of work. Elias let his hands rest flat on the desk for one breath, satisfied that preparation had reached completion. He opened the upper left tray once more and selected plate 1 by its edges, lifting only after the neighboring wool dividers released it evenly. The plate felt cool through his fingertips and lighter than its dark lines suggested. He moved it straight to the first padded stand, where it settled upright above the linen cloth. In the newly opened slot, the divider fabric remained smooth, and the tray base was lean canja worn plate bites. Elias noted that protected contrast, then slid an unmarked place card into the gap so the sequence could not close around the empty space. He returned the tray to its stop without fully closing it. This was now the active source, clearly distinguished from the 5 closed trays. The brass lamp illuminated the plate at a shallow angle, showing both the drawn high fibers and a faint film across the glass. The small key held the inventory slips, the blue ledger preserved the verified counts, and the gray enamel mug stood safely beyond reach. Elias turned the linen cloth so a fresh corner faced his working hand. The cabinet inventory was finished, and the first plate waited in a prepared place for cleaning. Elias began with the loose dust because anything lifted dry would not be drawn across the glass later. Holding plate 1 upright by its narrow edges, he angled it over the linen cloth and passed a soft corner of the cloth along the top edge without touching the inked face. A pale line gathered on the fabric. He turned the plate, supported it in the first padded stand, and used another clean fold to sweep the back in long strokes from center to edge. The dust moved visibly in the lamplight, first as a soft veil, then as 2 fine crescents at the margins. He lifted those crescents with separate dabs rather than carrying them around the corners. On the front, he worked around the title strip with smaller movements, preserving the thin marginal lettering. The high fibers drawn there grew distinct, parallel strokes that widened, crossed, and tapered without becoming a sheet. When both faces showed an even reflection, Elias set the plate in the clean stand and inspected the linen. The dust lay on the cloth instead of the glass, a modest but complete transfer. He marked plate 1 clean on the inventory line and removed plate 2 from the active tray. Plate 2 had collected more dust along one short edge, where the divider's wool rose lower than its neighbor. Elias rested that edge just above the cloth and folded a fresh strip of linen around his forefinger. He followed the glass border from corner to corner, never pushing inward toward the drawing. Each pass ended beyond the plate, carrying its faint gray trace away. The surface cleared unevenly at first. The upper half reflected the lamp as a clean amber bar, while the lower half scattered it into a dull bloom. He changed to an unused fold and worked the dull area in straight, overlapping lines. Under the bloom appeared a set of delicate hooks, each one turning at a different angle before fading into blank glass. Elias compared the cleared half with the still muted strip near the base. The contrast showed exactly where another pass was needed. He made it, then held the plate beside plate 1 without letting the edges meet. The 2 high forms differed in direction and density, not in cleanliness. That was the standard he wanted. He moved the lamp a finger width along its mat and watched its amber reflection cross both plates at the same measured pace. No dull patch lingered after the light had passed, and no cleaned area brightened more than its neighbor. He reversed the plates in the stands and repeated the check from the other side. Their response remained even, confirming that the visible differences belonged to ink and form rather than residue. Plate 2 entered the clean stand behind the first, and its number received a second small tick in the ledger. The next 4 plates formed a continuous sequence, so Elias cleaned them in order and watched the inked forms broaden from threads into veils. Plate 3 required only 2 dry passes. Plate 4 held a powdery patch around its number, which he lifted with the pointed corner of the linen cloth. Plate 5 showed fingerprints near one edge, old and dry, but they yielded to a slow polishing motion confined to the blank margin. Plate 6 was clear beneath a light film that vanished as soon as the cloth moved over it. With each plate, he repeated the same secure exchange: place card out, glass lifted by edges, place card back, tray steadied, glass brought to the cloth. The routine did not make the plates identical, it allowed their differences to emerge without distraction. By plate 6, the working cloth displayed 6 separate gray traces, and the clean stand held a visible progression from fine fibers to a nearly continuous high sheet. Elias turned the cloth so those traces could not return to the next surface. He counted the clean numbers aloud in a low voice, 1 through 6, and confirmed the same sequence in the blue ledger before attending to plate 7, the one that had sat slight low. He eased plate 7 upward until its corners cleared the wool. The cause of its lower position was immediately visible. A narrow fold in the base padding, no thicker than a doubled thread, had made a shallow channel. Elias placed the glass securely in the first stand, then used the blank card to raise and smooth the fold without inserting his fingers between the dividers. The wool relaxed into an even bed. He tested it with the card, which now stood at the same height as the neighboring plates, and recorded the adjustment beside his earlier pencil note. Only then did he clean the glass. A dry film covered both faces, but the line work beneath was sound. He polished from the open center toward the edges, uncovering several long strokes, whose ends feathered into fine branches. At the bottom margin, one tiny scale line had been obscured by dust lodged against the frame of ink. Elias folded the linen into a narrow ridge, and lifted the dust away parallel to the mark. The scale line reappeared intact. When he returned plate 7 temporarily to the clean stand, its drawing was legible and its eventual cabinet seat was level. One observation had resolved 2 small conditions without disturbing the sequence. Plates 8 through 12 completed the high form tray. Their surfaces responded to dry cleaning in different ways. 8 cleared at once. 9 needed attention at all 4 corners. 10 held a broad but very light film. 11 carried dust mostly on its back. 12 had a narrow haze along the title margin. Elias changed the linen fold whenever it showed color, and kept the used folds turned inward against his palm. The black lines sharpened one plate at a time. Thin cross fibers separated from long parallel bands. A nearly uniform veil revealed faint variations in thickness. An open field of strokes showed where blank glass had always been part of the form. After plate 12, he closed the active tray long enough to replace its place card with the clean sequence. Each plate descended into its original divider by number, now standing at an even height. Elias did not yet lock the cabinet, because the other groups remained to be cleaned. He simply returned the tray to its runners and opened the middle form tray. The first completed set caught the lamplight through the narrow cabinet gap, clear enough that its ink no longer seemed embedded in gray air. The middle plates carried rounded forms rendered with heavier lines, and their broader ink-made surface haze more noticeable. Elias cleaned the first sequence steadily until he reached the dotted plate 11. Dry passes removed the dust, yet a gray cast remained over the central row of small rounded shapes. He shifted the brass lamp behind the plate, then beside it. The cast followed the glass rather than the illumination, showing that it was a film on the surface. He laid the plate flat on the padded linen, keeping the inked margin outside his working area, and breathed once onto a blank corner. A small circle of moisture appeared and began to fade. With a clean, tightly folded section of cloth, he moved through that circle in a single straight stroke. The glass beneath became transparent, while the untouched portion remained muted. The division was exact enough to answer the question. The drawing itself had not faded. Elias repeated the breath and stroke in narrow adjoining bands, allowing each one to clear before beginning the next. The haze lifted into the linen, and a precise row of inked cloud forms emerged from end to end, crisp against the dark pad below. He raised the clean plate by its edges and turned it slowly before the lamp. No bloom followed the reflection now. Only the black forms interrupted the clear amber bar. The small clouds began as detached humps, joined into a broken band, and ended as a smoother layer, a full transition that the haze had reduced to one indistinct gray patch. Elias compared the front and back to ensure no moisture remained at the borders. He passed a dry fold once along the blank lower edge, then stood the plate beside the others. Its dotted cross-reference made sense in this clearer state. Though catalogued among middle forms, the final drawings resembled lower broken layers when scale was ignored. That visual contrast would matter during grouping. He added a concise note to the temporary slip. Haze removed, sequence fully legible, and underlined neither word. The action itself provided sufficient emphasis. After setting the cloth's damp fold aside to air, he resumed with a dry section. The plate that had seemed uniformly gray now offered the cabinet's most readable internal progression, and the question raised by its surface had received a complete, visible answer. Elias continued through the low-form tray, taking extra care at plate 36 while its loose divider remained empty. He cleaned the glass first and placed it in the center stand. Its drawing showed a low bank divided into rounded sections, with a dark underside and 5 narrow openings. Then he attended to the divider. The wool strip had not torn, its upper corner had merely slipped beneath the cedar lip. Using the blank card, he guided the corner upward and pressed it flat along the channel. A second card test showed firm support on both bases. Elias wrote padding reseated beside the plate number and returned the glass only after checking that no thread touched the inked margin. The remaining low plates carried more ledge dust than face hades. He wiped the exposed cedar ledge before lifting each, so falling dust could not settle on the clean glass. As the sequence advanced, broad sheets gave way to banks, rolls, and broken patches with sky between them. By the final plate, the tray base was clean, every divider stood evenly, and the strongest low-layer contrasts were visible without a gray cast. The mixed pairs and local comparison plates required attention to their marginal arrows, as well as their central joints. Elias worked through each pair together, cleaning the smoother form first and its textured companion second. He set them side by side on separate padded stands, checked that both reflected the lamp evenly, then returned them to adjacent places. In the local sequence he found fine dust lodged around the tiny inked ridgeline. Rather than polish across it, he folded the linen into a soft point and lifted the dust in short touches from the blank spaces above and below. The ridge remained sharp, and the directional arrows emerged with their small heads intact. One plate showed a broken layer above the western slope, almost identical in arrangement to the cleaned plate 36, though its scale and month differed. Elias recorded the relationship on the second temporary slip for later comparison. When all 9 local plates were clean, he held the linen away from the desk and counted its used folds. Each gray mark corresponded to dust removed from a known group. He enclosed the used surface inside the cloth, exposing a broad, clean side for the final 5 plates. The seasonal review plates needed only light wiping. Elias gave them the same complete examination. He cleaned each face, read each number, checked each reserved divider, and returned the plate to its original place. Then he closed that tray and reviewed the 6 cleaning entries in the blue ledger. Every plate number carried a tick. The notes for plate 7's patter, 11's haze, and plate 36's divider now ended with clear. Elias gathered the used portion of the linen cloth into a loose fold and set it beside the cedar case, keeping the clean portion uppermost for handling during comparison. He turned the brass lamp across the cabinet fronts. Behind each cedar pull, the cleaned glass caught a narrow line of light instead of diffusing it. No moisture remained, no plate waited outside a divider, and no place card remained inside a completed tray. He closed the ledger on the cleaning page, but left the 2 comparison slips beneath the small brass key. The dust and haze had been removed, the drawings had become legible, and the collection was ready to be grouped by what the clear lines actually showed. The cleaned plates were meant to answer distinctions, not simply to shine on the lamp, so Elias converted the desk from a cleaning station into a comparison table. He carried the gray enamel mug to the window shelf, closed the cedar case around the blank cards, and spread the clean side of the linen cloth from the cabinet toward his chair. On it he placed 3 long padded rails parallel to the desk edge. The rear rail would hold higher forms, the center rail middle forms, and the nearest rail lower forms. He copied those 3 words onto plain slips and tucked one beneath each rail, then measured the spaces with an empty card so no plate would touch its neighbor. The brass lamp stood at the left end, angled across all 3 rows. Its light would reveal texture without shining directly into Elias's eyes. He opened the blue ledger to the cabinet index and set the 2 temporary slips beside it. The arrangement made the task visible before the first plate moved. Height would determine the row, texture the place within it, and the recorded scale would settle any lightness but surface. Elias opened the high-form tray and began with the clearest examples. He placed the first 6 high plates along the rear rail in their recorded sequence. Each entered its padded notch upright, leaving enough glass exposed for the line work to be compared. From his chair, the differences formed a gradual sentence. Fine, isolated fibers occupied the left. Crossed fibers followed. Then wider bands gathered until the rightmost plate showed a thin, continuous veil. Elias read the marginal height marks and found them consistent with the rear position. He did not yet arrange by beauty or density. Instead, he turned each plate a few degrees until the lamp reflection fell through the same blank corner, giving every drawing equal light. Plate 4 needed a narrower space because its title strip extended farther along the edge, so he shifted the neighboring notches without changing their order. When the first half stood aligned, he added plates 7 through 12. Plate 7 now rose to the same level as the others after the padding correction. Together, the 12 presented high forms ranging from fibrous to smooth, all supported by scale rather than by appearance alone. Elias placed a small marker after plate 12. He lowered himself to the chair and viewed all 12 from the eye height he would use for later comparisons. One rear notch sat slightly proud, causing its plate to interrupt the otherwise level upper line. Elias removed that plate, pressed the padded base flat with the blank card, and returned the glass. The upper corners aligned, while the common lamp reflection remained visible through every blank margin. The back row was established as a reliable reference against which the more ambiguous sheets could be tested. The middle form tray supplied a wider variety. Elias began with rounded fields, placing detached heaps to the left, joined masses in the center, and broad, nearly continuous layers to the right. He read the scale marks before choosing each position, then checked texture after the plate stood in the rail. Smooth top forms remained apart from those with piled contours. The dotted cross reference plate 11 waited in its temporary stand rather than entering the row immediately. Its newly revealed internal transition deserved comparison from more than one angle. As Elias filled the center rail, the difference between height and texture became practical. Two plates shared the same middle height yet belonged far apart because one showed a uniform sheet and the other a field of rounded towers. Conversely, a smooth middle sheet resembled the rear row's continuous veil until the heavier scale marks and firmer lower boundary distinguished it. He set those two plates directly, one behind the other, looked through their blank margins, and then separated them again. The rear form remained high and thin. The center form remained deeper and lower. With that contrast settled, he completed the middle row except for the cross-reference plate. He filled the front rail with the low forms, beginning with level sheets and proceeding toward rolls, banks, and broken layers. The nearness of the row made their inked undersides prominent. Plate 36, supported by its reseated divider earlier, entered a notch near the right where its rounded sections could be compared with other broken banks. Elias aligned the scale bars along a common imaginary line and saw the low sequence clarify at once. A smooth low sheet could resemble the middle sheet behind it when viewed alone, but beside one another the low plate carried a heavier base, a softer upper edge, and larger marks for the same drawn span. He moved the low plate half a notch left until the pair overlapped in his sight line, confirmed all three clues, and restored it to the front row. Then he placed the local comparison plate with the western ridge nearby, though not within the formal sequence, using a separate padded stand. Its directional arrow pointed the same way as the evening layer outside. By the time the front rail was full, all three heights occupied distinct planes on the desk, and the visual similarities no longer erased their measured differences. Texture came next. Within the rear row, Elias shifted the fibrous plates toward the window side, and the smoother veils toward the ledger side, preserving their internal progression. Within the center row, he separated rounded from level forms, leaving a deliberate gap between the two groups. The front row required finer choices, smooth sheets first, then shallow rolls, then banks, then broken rounded sections. He lifted only one plate at a time, keeping a place card in the vacated notch so its previous position remained apparent until the new one was decided. The movement gave the rows a measured rhythm without becoming automatic. Every shift answered a visible property. Thin strokes gathered with thin strokes, piled contours gathered with other open patches, open patches gathered with other open. Elias occasionally lowered the lamp so its light skimmed the ink, making the difference between a drawn edge and surface reflection unmistakable. When the sorting was complete, he stood at the end of the desk and looked lengthwise through the three rails. Height receded from front to back, while texture changed from smooth to structured across each row. The two organizing principles now worked together instead of competing. Only the dotted cross-reference plate remained in the temporary stand. Cleaned of haze, it showed a sequence from separate rounded forms to a joined, broken layer. Its cabinet label placed it among middle forms, but the pencil dot referred to low-layer use, and its final section looked persuasive beside plate 36. Elias first set it in the center row among the rounded fields. The opening figures belonged there comfortably, yet the final joined layer appeared heavy beside its neighbors. He then moved it, without committing, to the front row beside the broken banks. The final figures aligned, but the opening heaps looked too small and too lightly based. He returned the plate to the separate stand and consulted its scale marks. The sequence used 2 scales, divided by a tiny vertical line that the former haze had concealed. The opening group was middle height. The final comparison was a reduced study of a lower layer. The plate was not internally inconsistent. It was designed to show a transition between reference classes. Elias copied that fact onto the slip, resolving why a middle form plate had legitimately served a low comparison. The corrected understanding did not yet determine the best working order. Elias examined the cabinet index, where the dotted plate stood in the middle tray between 2 uniform sheets. That numerical placement was proper for storage, but the present comparison arrangement needed its most useful relation made visible. He placed the plate at the right end of the center row, immediately before the gap separating rounded forms from sheets. From there, its first figures completed the rounded progression, while its final reduced study pointed visually toward the low, broken plates in front. He set plate 36 1 notch farther right, so the 2 final sections aligned diagonally. The lamp picked out their shared open spaces and their different scale bars at once. A viewer could now see both resemblance and reason for separation. Elias removed the temporary place card from the old notch and straightened the center rail. The shift corrected an order that had seemed plausible when the glass was hazy. Nothing had been reclassified beyond its evidence. The plate simply occupied the comparison position where both halves could be read honestly. To test the entire arrangement, Elias chose one example from each row and covered the marginal titles with narrow blank cards, leaving the drawings and scale bars visible. He began with a smooth sheet from the rear, a smooth sheet from the center, and a smooth sheet from the front. Without the words, the 3 appeared related, but the scale bars, lower boundaries, and stroke weight still led him from high to low. He uncovered the titles and confirmed the sequence. Next, he tested a rounded middle field, the cross-reference plate, and the broken low bank. The progression held again, detached and lighter, transitional at 2 scales, joined and heavily based. Finally, he compared 3 open textures whose blank spaces occupied similar proportions. Their edge character separated them even when openness did not. Elias removed the cards, returned them to the cedar case, and made a small check in the ledger beside height, texture, and scale. The order had survived comparison without relying on names. That proof mattered more than the neatness of the rows, though the rows had also become calmer and easier to read. He then prepared the pair for the veranda. Plate 36 showed the broken lower bank with rounded sections and narrow openings. A neighboring low plate showed an almost featureless sheet, whose only variation lay in a shallow thinning along one edge. Both matched the observed height class, but their textures offered a useful contrast. Elias lifted them from the front rail and placed each in its own padded sleeve lined with soft linen, leaving the numbered upper corner. He wrote the 2 numbers on the second temporary slip, followed by broken and smooth, and laid the slip across the sleeves. The local comparison plate with the western ridge would remain indoors as a fixed reference. Carrying 3 would add no necessary distinction. He restored the empty front row notches with place cards, then looked once more at the diagonal relation between the cross-reference plate and the remaining broken forms. The corrected position still read clearly after plate 36's removal. The comparison table was stable, and the 2 selected plates represented a precise choice rather than a general resemblance. Before leaving the desk, Elias recorded the completed order in 5 concise lines. 3 height rows, texture progressing from smooth to structured, scale checked throughout, transitional plate placed at the center row boundary, and 2 low candidates selected for the sky comparison. He folded the first temporary slip into the blue ledger beside the cabinet inventory, where its resolved notes would remain attached to the evening's work. The second slip stayed with the padded sleeves. Then he returned every plate not needed outside to its numbered tray, reversing the handling route 1 glass at a time. The formal cabinet order remained unchanged, while the ledger preserved the temporary grouping and its correction. When the last comparison rail stood empty, he folded the rails together and set them near the cabinet for later use. The desk again offered a clear path from lamp to ledger. Elias buttoned the lower edge of his slate waistcoat, took 1 padded sleeve in each hand, and turned toward the covered veranda. Height, texture, and order had been settled indoors. The living sky would now decide between the two low forms. The covered veranda ran along the western side of the station, deep enough that the rail and the workbench remained dry beneath its roof. Elias opened the inner door with his elbow, keeping both padded sleeves upright in his hands, and paused on the threshold while his eyes adjusted from brass lamplight to the broader evening. The air carried the mild scent of cedar boards and cooling grass. Low clouds crossed the valley in a nearly level band, pale gray above and slightly deeper underneath. Between them, over the far hills, thin spaces showed a washed blue that grew clearer toward the west. Elias set the sleeves on the veranda workbench, well back from the rail, and checked that the linen lining still enclosed every glass edge. He then returned inside for the blue ledger, the small brass key resting on it. Winter text. The lamp belonged on the sheltered wall shelf, where its flame could illuminate a plate without meeting the open air. Once it stood there, Elias placed the ledger on the bench and the key on the page to hold it flat. The veranda had become a secure observation place, and both sky and references were within one unhurried turn of his head. He began without glass, giving the present layer a fresh description based only on sight. Its base appeared low relative to the western ridge. Its upper boundary was soft, with rounded rises too shallow to form separate heaps. The center over the valley looked continuous, but nearer the hills it divided into broad sections with narrow, horizontal openings. Movement was slow from southwest to northeast, most visible where an opening passed above a fixed roofline. Elias marked that roofline with the edge of his thumb on the rail, and watched until the same opening cleared it. The interval provided direction without needing an instrument. He noted no rapid change in depth or color. Instead, the western margin thinned by degrees, allowing the faded blue beyond it to occupy more of each gap. He wrote 5 spare words on the temporary slip: low, soft, joined, opening, northeast, then looked up to ensure the written terms had not pulled his attention away from the whole. He shifted to the next gap between veranda posts and repeated the visual check against a different group of roofs. The same low base and soft, joined upper edge continued across that span. He added no 6th word, because the second position confirmed the first description instead of enlarging it. Returning to the center of the bench, he placed the pencil across the slip and let both fixed views settle into one observation. The layer remained as he had described it. Only after establishing that independent view did he reach for the first padded sleeve. The first plate showed the smooth, low sheet. Elias withdrew it by the side edges and held it beneath the roof, never extending the glass beyond the veranda rail. He positioned its lower margin just below the western skyline so the ink sheet and real layer could be compared without overlap. At first the broad level shapes agreed, and both carried a gently softened upper edge. Then the contrast became clearer. The plate's lower boundary ran almost uninterrupted from side to side, while the sky contained several distinct openings. Its surface remained uniform, but the real cloud layer gathered into shallow, rounded sections near every opening. Elias moved 2 steps along the bench, changing his line of sight while keeping the plate sheltered. The difference persisted against another part of the valley. He turned the glass slightly to remove the lamp's reflection and compared once more. The plate was a useful height match and a poor texture match. He said the distinction quietly. Height yes, texture no. Then returned the plate to its padded sleeve. The first candidate had done its work by showing exactly which resemblance was insufficient. Elias waited for the western opening to move past the ridgeline he had chosen. As it advanced, the cloud on either side revealed rounded, joined edges rather than a single, thinning sheet. That detail favored the second plate, but he allowed the change to complete before lifting the glass. A strip of faded blue widened above the hills, then held at nearly the breadth of his thumb. He noted the time in the ledger margin. The layer beyond the opening stayed connected, and the next section carried a darker, level underside. Elias traced neither form in the air nor on paper. He kept his hands still and watched the relation settle. The action in the sky was quiet but definite. Joined sections passed, a space widened, blue appeared, and another joined section followed. When the opening reached a cedar post, he had a fixed measure for its width. He placed a small pencil mark beside the post's position on his temporary sketch line, then closed the pencil. The sky had supplied a complete sequence against which the broken lower layer plate could be tested. He removed plate 36 from the second sleeve. Its clean glass scarcely announced itself except at the edges, while the inked bank ran across the center in rounded, connected sections. 5 narrow openings interrupted the drawing. Elias held the plate below the skyline and aligned its small direction arrow with the valley's southwest to northeast movement. The first comparison showed a stronger agreement than the smooth plate, rounded upper sections, level darker base, joined mass, and openings placed within the layer rather than along its outer edge. He lowered the plate, looked directly at the sky, and raised it again. The broadest inked opening corresponded in proportion to the gap beside the cedar post, though the real gap continued to widen slowly. The scale marks also supported the observed low height. Elias shifted the glass a hand's breadth to compare another section. Again, the broken structure held. The plate did not reproduce the sky as a picture. It supplied the same organizing form. Had distinction kept the comparison exact. He returned his gaze to the real layer once more and found the same rounded edges passing above the western roofs. To make the choice independent of memory, Elias set both sleeved plates on the bench with their numbers concealed by the folded linen. He exposed only the central drawings, placing the smooth sheet on the left and the broken bank on the right. From 3 paces away, he looked first at the sky, then at the pair. The left plate repeated the layer's breadth but omitted its open structure. The right plate repeated both the breadth and the joined sections, while its inked openings gave an up-close visual analog to the faded blue gaps. He approached, uncovered the numbers, and wrote plate 36 on the temporary slip beside the 5 descriptive words. Under the smooth plate's number he wrote height reference only. Under 36 he wrote height and texture reference. A concise contrast completed the choice without diminishing the first plate's value. Elias slid the smooth plate fully into its sleeve, followed by the selected plate after one last edge inspection. Both glasses remained clear and dry. The question had not required forcing one example into total likeness. It had required identifying which example explained more of what the sky was doing. The widest opening passed the cedar post and revealed a calm band of blue extending toward the next upright. Elias used that change as a final payoff to the comparison. On plate 36, the largest open interval came after 3 joined rounded sections. In the sky, 3 shallow sections had likewise crossed his chosen roofline before the present widening. The numerical resemblance was incidental. The sequence, many saturated, was nada too, was nations blessed. He watched until the next cloud section entered the blue band, softening its eastern edge. Then he added thinning at western edge to the temporary slip. The observation now held both a classification and a direction of change. Nothing depended on what might happen later. The layer had already demonstrated its structure, the opening had already widened, and the following section had already arrived. Elias closed the ledger briefly under his palm, so the pages would not lift, though the veranda air was scarcely moving. He allowed himself a small, settled breath. The second plate had answered the visual question in the present moment, and the living example had supplied its own confirmation. He made one additional comparison with the local ridge reference left indoors by recalling only its fixed geographic line, not its cloud drawing. The real western hills sat lower in his view from the veranda than they did from the window, which could make a layer seem higher if the viewpoint were ignored. Elias crouched slightly until his eye matched the station window level marked on the cedar post, then observed the cloud base again. Its relation to the ridge still fell within the low class shown on plate 36. He rose, repeated the comparison from his ordinary stance, and wrote viewpoint check beside the height note. This small adjustment prevented an architectural difference from becoming a weather distinction. He did not need to bring out the third plate or multiply the exercise. The marked eye level and the selected scale were enough. With that settled, he wiped the clean outer faces of both padded sleeves using an unused corner of linen, removing a little veranda dust before it could reach the cabinet. The glass inside remained untouched and safe, ready to return. Elias extinguished the veranda lamp only after moving the sleeves and ledger through the inner door. The room's brass lamp still burned on the desk, holding a warm circle where the padded rails had been folded. He brought the sleeves to that circle one at a time, laid the blue ledger beyond them, and returned the small brass key to its place atop the temporary slips. Before closing the veranda door, he looked west once more. More blue showed between the low cloud forms, and the joined sections had grown shallower at their upper edges. The change agreed with his note of gradual thinning. He drew the door inward until its latch met gently, leaving the station room quiet and evenly lit. The transition indoors did not end the observation abruptly. It gathered the completed comparison into a place for Kadur Copes. He removed his slate waistcoat's lower button again for ease at the desk, and checked the cuffs of his cream shirt. Both were clean. His brown boots had brought in only a faint, dry trace from the veranda boards, which he brushed from the mat before approaching the glass. At the desk, Elias returned plate 36 to the empty notch indicated by its place card, then restored the smooth sheet to its neighboring notch. He verified both numbers against the temporary slip and removed the cards only after the glass stood securely. The comparison rails now held no gaps. He then moved the plates from the rails back into their original cabinet dividers, rather than the temporary visual grouping. The Temprisenland. Plate 36 descended beside its newly receded wool strip without catching. The smooth plate stood level in the slot before it. Elias closed each active tray enough to protect it, but left the cabinet door open for the later ledger check. He placed the two padded sleeves flat and the cedar case, folded the clean linen over them, and set the case beside the lamp. On the blue ledger page, his veranda notes formed a complete chain. Low height, soft joint texture, northeast movement, openings widening westward. Plate 36 selected, viewpoint checked. The sky comparison was finished. The plates were safely indoors, and every observation needed for classification had reached a clear conclusion. Elias opened the blue ledger to the clean leaf prepared at the start of the evening. The date and first hour waited in the upper corner, followed by the cabinet inventory on the facing page. He placed the veranda slip to the left, and the cleaning notes to the right, arranging the sources in the order the work had occurred. The brass lamp stood beyond the top margin so its light fell down the page without casting his hand's shadow across the lines. He uncapped the station pen, tested its flow on a small scrap cut in the cedar case, and drew one short, even stroke. The ink appeared blue-black and steady. Before writing, he read the 5 observation terms once. Low, soft, joined, opening, northeast. Each corresponded to something completed and seen. He did not add phrases for atmosphere or speculation. The ledger needed a durable record that another reader could reconstruct without sharing the evening. Elias wrote the station position, the start time, and the phrase low layer over valley. He paused until the ink settled into the paper, then compared the line with the view through the window. The words were spare, and the visible layer supported every one. HUD classification occupied the next line. Elias copied the scale reference from plate 36 and paired it with the viewpoint check made on the veranda. He wrote low class, base aligned above Western Ridge from marked eye level. The sentence preserved both conclusion and method without recounting the crouch beside the cedar post. He added the smooth comparison plate number in parentheses, followed by height reference, because that plate had supported the level even though it had not matched the texture. The selected plate followed after a semicolon. Plate 36, height and texture. Elias read the line aloud at conversational speed. It carried no surplus word, yet it distinguished the two references fairly. He placed the pen across the scrap rather than on the ledger, and looked at the marginal scale marks again through the cabinet's open door. Their position agreed with the copied figures. He then made a small check at the end of the line. With a narrow ruler held beneath the writing, he compared the alignment of the two plate numbers and saw that neither digit crowded the ruled margin. He lifted the ruler, examined its underside for fresh ink, and found it clean. The line had dried without smearing, so the supporting references could be read as readily as the classification itself. The height entry was complete. Observed relation, controlled viewpoint, supporting references, and clear choice all occupied one legible band of blue-black ink. Coverage required a number simple enough to repeat but honest about the openings. Elias divided the visible valley span into 10 familiar sections using the window, mullions, and rooflines as guides. At the beginning of the veranda watch, cloud had occupied roughly 8 sections, with narrow blue intervals inside 2 of them. By the later check, the western opening covered more of one section, but the overall layer still extended through the same broad span. Wrote 8/10 overall, western internal openings widening. That wording separated extent from continuity, preventing the broad coverage from implying an unbroken sheet. In the margin, he placed the first and last observation times, joined by a quiet dash. He did not calculate a rate from 2 short looks. The gradual direction of change was enough. After writing, he lifted his gaze through the window, where the western gap now showed as a longer pale stripe, while the eastern portion remained joined. The note still described the whole accurately. Elias blotted no ink yet. He left the page open so the entries could dry naturally while he prepared the texture line. For texture, He returned to the temporary grouping language, rather than inventing a new label. Smooth would have matched the first plate, but not the openings. Broken alone would have made the rounded, joined sections sound more separate than they appeared. He wrote joined rounded sections with shallow breaks. Underside level, upper edge soft. The semicolon divided structure from boundary, allowing each property to remain clear. He added no color adjective, since the evening light changed the visible gray more readily than it changed form. Beside the sentence he drew a tiny, open rectangle, the station's usual mark for visual confirmation, and left it empty until he checked the selected plate. Plate 36 stood in its divider behind the cabinet door, and compared the visible inked section with the ledger words, G, Yetienja, Utaba, to the Bishan joined, rounded, shallow breaks, level underside, soft, upper edge. Each term had a corresponding line. He filled the rectangle, closed the tray, and returned the pen to the page. The classification now described what had made the second plate the stronger match. Direction of movement came from the opening, crossing a fixed roofline and then the cedar post. Elias wrote southwest toward northeast, slow and consistent during observation. He followed it with a smaller note, determined from internal opening against roofline and post. The phrase explained why the direction applied to the layer rather than to a passing impression of light. He reviewed the times on the veranda slip and copied them accurately, maintaining the same hour notation used elsewhere in the ledger. When the figures were down, he drew a single line through the temporary pencil marks on the slip, showing that they had been transferred rather than discarded unnoticed. The brass key kept the remaining corner flat. Outside the window, moving along the recorded path, butter on the percoff. Elias waited until it had advanced visibly, then placed a confirmation tick after consistent. No later outcome was required. The second opening had already repeated the direction within the observation period. He closed the pen cap for a moment and flexed his fingers, allowing the movement entry to dry without any blotter touching the fresh strokes. The change note had to remain proportionate. Elias did not write clearing, because much of the valley still lay beneath the low layer. He did not write steady, because the western openings had plainly widened. He chose gradual thinning at western edge. Broader blue intervals, main layer retained. The two parts recorded change in continuity together. Beneath them he copied the later timed from one postmark to nearly two. Code, NID, with BG, Na9tas, Na. He checked the post through the window, where its dark vertical line framed the pale band beyond. The measurement was local, but repeatable from the marked eye level. Elias added veranda position to remove ambiguity. He then reviewed the sentence for any implied forecast, and found none. It said what had happened during the completed watch. The cloud layer could now be left to continue at its own pace without making the ledger incomplete. He set a fresh blotting sheet near the lower edge, but did not lower it yet. 3 lines of ink still held a faint sheen under the lamp. Angsty linked the evening's classification to the cabinet work. On a separate note line he wrote, archived plates cleaned before comparison. Haze removed from transitional plate. Scale division recovered. He gave the cross-referenced plate's number and its permanent middle form location, followed by the phrase, low study at second scale. That entry preserved the correction made during grouping without changing the cabinet's formal classification. He also recorded plate 7 padding leveled and plate 36 divider reseated, each followed by checked stable. These were not cloud observations, but they explained the collection's present condition and closed the 2 pencil notes from the inventory. Elias drew a neat tick beside each earlier condition line on the facing page. Now anyone reading the spread, result check, kolik ni, wall, yay, istray, k. He avoided describing the amount of dust or the motion of every wipe. Those belonged to the work, not to the durable classification. The ledger retained only the facts needed to understand why the glass was legible, and why one apparent ordering problem no longer. He assembled the main observation into one concise final entry. Low broken layer, 8/10 coverage, joined rounded sections, shallow openings widening west, moving southwest to northeast, compared with plates 31 and 36, latter selected for texture. The entire line fit between the ruled margins. Elias read it once from beginning to end, then covered each source slip, Laradas, and reference, wop way, Sandari gis and kybrins. It did. He uncovered the slips and checked every plate number against the cabinet index. 31 was the smooth height reference. 36 was the broken texture reference. No digits had been reversed. He added the end time at the right margin and placed a full stop after it. Next, he traced the entry with the blunt end of the capped pen, stopping at each comma to compare its clause with the matching source note. Height led to the scale reference, coverage to the window divisions, texture to the selected plate, movement to the roofline, and change to the western opening. Every clause had one source, and no source remained uncopied. He returned the slips to their original order and squared their corners beneath the brass key. The completed sentence held the evening in a form compact enough for later comparison, and specific for Jackson. Outside, more faded blue appeared, but the layer remained present exactly as the closing phrase implied. Elias resisted adding a second, less exact sentence merely because space remained on the line. The ink had lost its sheen. Elias lowered the fresh blotting sheet from top to bottom, allowing it to touch without sliding, and rested his palm lightly over the ledger for 3 breaths. When he lifted the sheet, a faint mirror of the darkest strokes appeared on the blotter, while the written lines remained sharp. He inspected the numbers, semicolons, and small confirmation boxes. None had feathered. He folded the veranda slip along its blank edge and placed it in a ledger pocket reserved for same-day working notes. The cleaning slip joined it after he copied its last resolved condition. He returned the small brass key to the cedar case temporarily, leaving the ledger page free for turning. Before closing the spread, veranda, comparison, classification, Uden, the menger disses, each nendered chaz. Each stage led to the next, and each noted condition ended with a result. He turned the page carefully. No damp ink transferred to the facing leaf. The record was both concise and complete. On the new page, Elias wrote one closing line for the station round. Cloud plates ready for return. Observation entered and checked. He left a small square beside the first clause because the plates still had to be placed in their padded dividers and the cabinet locked. Beside the second clause, he filled the square at once. The distinction kept the ledger faithful to the actual state of the room. He capped the pen, wiped its nib with the designated inner fold of linen, and laid it in the cedar case beside the padded sleeves. The gray enamel mug returned from the window shelf to a corner beyond the ledger. Its remaining tea, now fully cool, Elias drank it in 2 quiet swallows and dried the rim with a separate clean fold, then set the mug upside down on its small wooden coaster. A writing task had reached its end without leaving a promise on the page. Only the physical closure remained, clearly marked and immediately at hand. He rose from the chair, squared the blue ledger with the desk edge, and turned toward the open cabinet. Elias began the return with a clean count of everything outside the cabinet. The 3 padded rails lay folded beside the lamp. 2 padded sleeves rested inside the open cedar case. The linen cloth covered the desk, its used cleaning folds enclosed beneath a clean upper layer. The blue ledger showed the unfilled square beside cloud plates ready for return. No glass stood on the desk. All plates had already re-entered their trays after comparison, but their exact divider placement still required final verification. Elias opened the upper left tray to its felted stop and read the corner numbers from 1 through 12. Each plate stood within its own blue wool channel. Plate 7 now rose level with 6 and 8, confirming that the base fold remained smooth after reinsertion. He touched the cloth tab beside it with the blank checking card, felt even resistance, and withdrew the card without contacting the glass. Then he examined the tray's front ledge. It remained free of the dust removed earlier. The first sequence was clean, complete, and correctly supported. He eased the tray inward until its cedar pole sat flush, then made the first return tick in the ledger. The middle form tray required special attention to the transitional plate. Elias opened it, counted the first 8 numbers, crossed the central spacer with his gaze, and counted the second 8. The dotted plate stood in its permanent numerical slot, not at the temporary boundary position used on the comparison rail. Its upper corner showed both the number and the small pencil dot. Elias consulted the cabinet index, confirmed the cross-reference to the low study, and checked that the new ledger note described the 2 scales. He angled the brass lamp across the glass without removing it. The row of small forms revealed by cleaning remained clear, and the vertical scale division could still be seen. No lint from the padded rail had followed the plate into its divider. Elias inserted the blank card lightly into the empty inspection channel beside the sequence, confirming that the wool strips held their shape, then removed it. He moved his gaze from the plate's first scale to the ledger's middle form entry, then from the second scale to the recorded low study cross-reference. Each visual path ended at the proper note. He returned the index marker to the inside margin, where it could not project into the tray, and checked the dotted number once more. He closed the tray and pressed neither the glass nor the pull once it met the cabinet. The permanent order and the corrected interpretation now agreed. A second returned tick entered the ledger. In the low-form tray, numbers 29 through 42 progressed without interruption. Elias paused at 31, the smooth height reference, and 36, the selected texture reference. Both stood upright with their numbered corners facing outward. Plate 36's reseated wool divider rose evenly along its sides. Holding the glass without crowding it, he tested the adjacent padding, but the part they tossed but welt or the card met equal soft resistance and came away clean. Through the clear plate he could see the 5 inked openings and the rounded joined sections that had matched the valley layer. That visible pattern gave the handling sequence a quiet sense of completion. The comparison had been made, recorded, and returned to its exact place. Elias read the remaining numbers to 42 and found it clear. A comport whisper. He closed the tray slowly enough to hear the felt stop release, and the runner settle. The third tick joined the first two, completing the formal height groups. He verified the mixed form tray, pair by pair, smooth beside piled, continuous beside broken, thin beside dense. Every contrast occupied the bracketed positions shown in the ledger. The glass faces reflected the lamp as narrow, unclouded bands. In the local comparison tray, the 9 numbered plates followed their directional arrows. In months, Elias found the Western Ridge reference and checked that its fixed ink line remained sharp after cleaning. It had stayed indoors, yet it had helped him recognize the viewpoint difference on the veranda. The final ledger note preserved that check without overstating the plate's role. He counted the other 8, closed the tray, and marked both groups returned. The seasonal review tray came last. 5 plates occupied the first designated dividers, and 11 reserved openings followed. Elias passed the blank card through each opening in a single visual sweep, watching it appear between the wool strips without inserting it deeply. No loose slip or cleaning fold had entered an empty space. He closed the 6th tray. All cabinet contents were now enclosed within their proper shallow drawers, and 6 returned ticks stood beside 6 verified groups. Elias inspected the cabinet as a whole before closing its door. All 6 cedar pulls sat flush. None projected far enough to meet the inner panel. The label frames remained aligned, and the doorstop held the weight without strain. He moved the brass lamp from left to right, looking for any glass corner or divider cord extending beyond a tray. The fronts showed only cedar, brass labels, and even shadow. He placed the folded padded rails in the lower storage compartment beneath the trays, where 3 shallow grooves held them flat. The 2 sleeves followed into their fitted space inside the cedar case, along with the blank checking cards and the station pen. He folded the case lid down and secured its small clasp. The linen cloth still required attention, so he carried it by its clean outer corners to the side table, opened it once, and shook no dust into the room. Instead, he folded each used surface inward, quarter by quarter, until every gray trace remained enclosed. He set the neat parcel in the washing basket beneath the table. The desk and cabinet approach were clear. He returned to the blue ledger and filled the square beside cloud plates ready for return. After it, he added 6 trays checked, all dividers stable, cabinet fronts flush. The words converted the physical inspection into a durable closure note. Elias placed the final blotting strip over that line while he moved the temporary working slips from the ledger pocket into the dated envelope at the back. The slips were no longer loose, yet they remained available beside the formal entry. He closed the envelope flap without sealing it, then checked that the inventory markers did not protrude beyond the page edges. One pale tab extended slightly near the top, so he slid it inward until the ledger could close without bending it. He lowered the blue cover and ran his hand once along the cloth spine. The book rested squarely on the desk. He lifted the blotting strip and found the closure line dry. With the observation and the cabinet conditions recorded, no unwritten task remained between the ledger and the glass. The small brass key came out of the cedar case for the final time. Elias held it in his right hand while his left guided the cabinet door away from its stop. The hinges moved with the same quiet steadiness as before. He paused when the door stood a hand's breadth from the frame and looked down the closing gap. Every tray remained flush. The storage compartment was shut. No linen edge, place card, or paper marker across the sill. He continued until the door met the frame evenly at top and bottom. There was no pressure from within and no need to push. The key entered the escutcheon, turned through its short arc, and brought the locked tongue home with a clear click. Elias tested the closure by resting 2 fingers on the cedar pull and drawing outward once. The door held. He turned the key back only far enough to withdraw it, leaving the lock engaged, and placed the key in the small fitted loop inside the cedar case. The loop clasped its stem, preventing it from wandering beneath papers. He shut the case again. Glass, padding, trays, door, and lock had each reached their proper resting state. Elias restored the room around the completed work. He moved the brass lamp to the center of its usual desk mat and lowered the wick until the flame became a small, steady oval. The blue ledger went beneath the lamp's right edge, far enough away that the cover remained cool. The closed cedar case sat beside it, parallel to the ruled pages within. He turned the gray enamel mug upright, rinsed it at the small basin, and dried it with the cloth reserved for cups rather than the linen used on glass. Once dry, it returned to its round coaster. He brushed a few cedar grains from the desk into his palm and placed them in the waste tin, then wiped the bare wood with one clean pass. His cream cuffs stayed clear of ink, and the slate waistcoat carried no dust. At the doormat he pressed each brown boot heel once, leaving the veranda trace outside the working area. The station room regained its ordinary arrangement, but the order now contained the evening's completed observation rather than merely awaiting it. He made a last circuit without reopening anything. At the cabinet, he touched the locked door and saw the key absent from the escutcheon, safely held in its case. At the desk, he checked the ledger's date through the small label window and confirmed that the blotting sheet lay between the proper leaves. He lifted the cedar case just enough to feel that its clasp held, then set it back within the rectangular polish mark it had occupied at the beginning. The gray enamel mug stood centered on its coaster, and the brass lamp wick rested below the burner lip, ready to be lowered after the circuit. At the window, he looked across the valley. The low layer had thinned into broader joint sections, with calm blue intervals extending between them. Its movement remained toward the northeast, and the western edge showed the gradual opening recorded earlier. Elias did not add another entry. The end time had already closed the formal observation, and the later view confirmed rather than changed it. He drew the inner curtain only halfway, leaving the upper glass open to the softened sky. Then he checked the veranda latch and the room door latch, each with one gentle press. He ran his fingertips along the desk edge once, finding no projecting slip, glass corner, or loose thread. The station held no scattered tool, exposed plate, damp cloth, or unfinished note. His circuit ended where it began, beside the desk, with every object accounted for. Elias sat for a final minute in the brass lamp's reduced light. The cabinet's cedar panels gave back a warm, even sheen, concealing no uncertainty about their contents. The inventory named every plate, the cleaning had cleared each surface, the grouping had distinguished height from texture, and the veranda comparison had selected the broken lower layer. In the blue ledger, the gradual western thinning and the resolve padding adjustments. Yal, 3 gay, U-code. The gray enamel mug was clean, the linen cloth folded for washing, the cedar case clasped, and the small brass key secured inside it. Beyond the half-drawn curtain, open bands of faded blue rested between the remaining low cloud forms. The valley looked a little lighter, neither transformed nor waiting for anything from him. Elias lowered the lamp wick until the flame disappeared, leaving the window's soft evening light for the few steps to the door. He closed the station behind him, with the cabinet locked and the record complete. The cloud plates were clean, ordered, protected, and at rest. The evening's work was fully finished.